It's a good sign. Okay, I think we are in business. Um, it's a great privilege to be hosted by many organizations who are sponsoring this event. Thank you to Howard and to the many people I've met for a warm welcome, for your kindness, and for so many stimulating conversations. It's really heartening to see such a wonderful turnout in this beautiful place and this wonderful community here at the church. And so I'm delighted to share some of my research and teaching with you. And I'm just going to jump right into it. And I'm going to take you to the Middle Ages, but it's going to take us a minute to get there. And we're going to get there by way of one of my favorite artifacts in Jewish history. This is called the Anson Menorah, and it was created for the bicentennial of the United States in 1986. So if you look at it, you can see Anson, who was an immigrant to the United States, bought a bunch of bicentennial, we might call them tchotchkes, of the Statue of Liberty, and he fabricated a menorah to be used on the holiday of Hanukkah from this. And so you see a series of statues of liberty. You would read it from left to right, and I'll tell you, they on their pedestals, they all have a different event in Jewish history on them. I'll show you. And of course, in the middle, you see an eagle and the symbol of the United States. So this was something that Anson created on the to mark the events. A little bit more about Manfred Anson. He was a Holocaust survivor. He was 11 years old when the Nazis rose to power in Germany. He escaped to Australia in the 1940s. His brother was murdered in a concentration camp. In the 1960s, somewhat miraculously, he reconnected with his family. His sister Sigrid had taken refuge in the United States, sadly, and he reunited with her and moved to America from Australia. Anson collected all sorts of Jewish memorabilia over the course of his life. And you'll see that the story he tells with his menorah speaks to his vision of Jewish history. This menorah was the first menorah used at the first ever White House Hanukkah party. At the first ever White House Hanukkah party, President at the time, Barack Obama, said, like the Maccabees, the heroes of the Hanukkah story, Anson fought against tyranny. Anson, said the president, sought a place where he could live his life and practice his religion free from fear, ultimately settling in America. The menorah he designed serves as a reminder that our country endures as a beacon of hope and of freedom wherever you come from, whatever your faith. So I want to honor the story and the history of Manfred Anson in part through my lecture. But let's get into some of the details. So this tells a story of what I would call a meta-narrative. Meta-narrative is like, what are the big stories we use to order history? Jewish history is vast. And so we have to come up with a way to chop it up into little periods. We find watershed moments to help us make sense of it. And so I want you to read this from left to right with me. This is the story he tells. The first candle, the first night of Hanukkah, represents to Anson the Exodus from Egypt, led by Moses. The second event is something called the Babylonian exile, when the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. This is during the time of the prophet Jeremiah, and the Judean elites are exiled to Babylonia, where they live until the Persians allow them to return about 150 years later. The third event is indeed related to the story of Hanukkah. This is the revolt led by the Maccabees against the Greek emperor Antiochus Epiphanes. The fourth event are two revolts that happen against Rome in the 1st and 2nd century that lead to the destruction of the Second Temple, right? So what you see in Jerusalem today are the remnants of that Second Temple at the Western Wall. There was a second revolt almost a century later that led to other reprisals and almost to the extinction of Jewish life in Rome and Palestine, but not quite. The fifth event, and I'm going to return to this later, is called Galut. Galut is a Hebrew word. You might accidentally learn some Hebrew and Arabic today, so please hold on tight. And it means something akin to exile or diaspora. I'm coming back to that. 6, we go from Galut all the way to the year 1897, when Theodore Herzl and others organized the first Congress dedicated to the idea of creating a Jewish homeland. 7, the Holocaust. And then 8, the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. And at the center, the candle called the Shamus, which you use to light all the other candles, is the bicentennial dates for the United States. So think for a second, like how would you summarize the story this artifact tells us a story? It tells us the story of a man who survived the Second World War and who found a new home, and who knew both the deep terror, the nadir of modern Jewish history through the Holocaust, but who came to find meaning and belonging and hope in his journey to the United States. So I'm going to ask you to do something, which is to hold 2 opposing thoughts in your mind for a moment. I think this is a beautiful story. I honor Anson's legacy, but I'm also going to critique it and the story it tells about medieval Jewish history. Galut. So galut is a term that has a kind of some negative baggage. Because after the creation of the State of Israel and after the Holocaust, galut was seen as a time of dispossession, of exile, of vulnerability, sometimes of weakness, sometimes of persecution. And here he's using galut to represent over almost 1,500 years of history. From the year 132, when the second revolt against the Romans was quashed, until the first sort of symbolic beginnings of Zionism in 1897. Now, from my experience sort of teaching medieval Jewish history, this is not an uncommon feeling. For a lot of Jews, and I think for a lot of people generally about Jewish history, the Jewish Middle Ages functions as this time of like undifferentiated suffering. And indeed, there are events I can teach you about the Middle Ages that were horrible, right? That we don't want to repeat. However, there is such a rich story that gets lost when our knowledge of Jewish history of the Middle Ages begins and ends with galut. And so my job today is to help fill this sort of category of galut with a larger meaning, right? And your job is to try to attach some of those meanings and to sort of instill them in your mind. So why has galut sort of gotten this sort of dark baggage? So because of the destruction of the Second Temple, I argue like a dark shadow was cast forward in time, and that the Middle Ages were a period when Jews were alienated from the land of Israel largely, where they often didn't have the right to settle. And the Holocaust not only destroyed much of European Jewry, but it changed the way Jews thought about history. And in the shadow of the Holocaust projected backward onto the Middle Ages, it was hard for people not to see foreshadowing. That the events of the Middle Ages somehow foreshadowed the much more calamitous events of the 20th century. But indeed, that's not the way history happens. It unfolds in a contingent way, right? That's not linear or predictable. So I'm of a generation of scholars that study the Jewish Middle Ages through a collection of documents that Howard alluded to that allows us to tell many new stories. And I think these stories are important. They show us the richness of Jewish life. They show us the richness of Muslim life and Christian life in the Middle Ages and how they were all intertwined. And they give us a way, I think, for thinking about the future and how we can pursue an alternate future and country and a world in which we want to live and we want people to thrive. These are just some of the books published over the last 17 years and the topics that they talk about. Books about heresy in the Jewish community, books about Jewish merchants and their Muslim business partners, books about women as they moved to the age of their first marriage and how they secured favorable marital matches, books about Jewish law and mercantile life in the Mediterranean, books about Jews going to Jewish courts and Muslim courts, kind of Judge Wapner meets the Middle Ages. And then finally, in the bottom right corner, I'm pleased to say that's the cover of my forthcoming book, which will come out in January. So how can we tell these stories that I'm building up with these impossibly high expectations? Well, so another step on our story begins in what might seem to you to be an unlikely place. We have to go through the biographies of really my 2 favorite Scottish Presbyterians in history. So these are the twin sisters, Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson, who were twins. Agnes was 20 minutes older. She would probably want me to say that. So they lived in Cambridge, England. Their father was a widower and a very forward-looking man who wanted his daughters to get the education that boys had. He wanted them to know how to ride horses. He wanted them to know Hebrew and Greek and Syriac. And he said, you can travel anywhere in the world. You just have to learn the language first. And they did. So Agnes and Margaret, who were affectionately known around Cambridge as the Gibloos, right, based on their married names, um, traveled to Egypt and to what was then Ottoman Palestine one winter, and they returned to Cambridge with the document you see on the right. Now, these women knew Hebrew, they knew Syriac, and they knew their Bible very, very well. But there were some things they found from their latest trip to the Near East where they bought antiquities off the antiquities market, but they weren't quite sure. So they did what you would have done, and they found a Romanian Jewish professor of rabbinics at Cambridge Library, a man named Solomon Schechter, who you see here in the photograph, who would later come to the United States and be the first chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City. And they invited Mr. Schechter, excuse me, Professor Schechter, to their home, and they said, we've got something to show you. He said, okay, I'll come take a look at it. So he comes over, he's leafing through the different things. He has a deep knowledge of Hebrew literature. And he says, can I take this home with me? Right? I need to sort of do a little bit of research. Sure, sure, sure. He leaves. They sit down to have tea. Knock on the door a few hours later, and it is a telegram, right? Sent from the center of town to their home on the outskirts of Cambridge. And it says, important, come see me tonight. Schechter was known to be sort of eccentric, so the sisters didn't really think anything particularly of it. They sat back down to tea. A few hours later, another knock at the door, and it's a letter, which it turns out Schechter had written before the telegram, but it just took a little longer to get there. And you see this handwritten letter here on the screen. What does the handwritten letter say? It says, do not speak about this to anyone, but I think you have discovered a page from the lost work of the Wisdom of Ben Sira, better known as the Book of Ecclesiasticus. The Wisdom of Ben Sira had existed, but only in its Greek translation and its Syriac translation. So indeed, these sisters had unknowingly bought on the antiquities market a piece of Hebrew literature that had been lost to the world for probably the better part of a millennium. So where do these materials come from? They came from a place called the Cairo Geniza. So what you're looking at on the right is sort of the modern building that was just restored in Cairo. You can go here. Of one of the many synagogues that existed in Cairo in the Middle Ages. Well, they renovated the synagogue after a fire, and they built a chamber where they deposited worn-out prayer books, things they would use to sing from, worn-out copies of the Bible, popular literature that people were done using, and they never had to empty this chamber because it was so large. They intended, theoretically, to bury this material because they had a reverence for writing, especially writings that might have the name of God written. But for reasons we don't really understand, for a millennium, the bulk of this material was never buried. But Schechter, when he found about this piece of literature, he said, where did you get this? And they tell him. Then begins a long saga of Schechter getting diplomats, local Egyptian elites, the local Egyptian Jewish community, and Cambridge to send him to Cairo, where he worked for weeks, taking out over 300,000 pieces of paper from this synagogue and bringing it back to Cambridge, England. Here's a famous photograph of Schechter doing the initial work of sorting the crates. And he were to write, like he would have been a great marketer. He could have written for TV Guide. He said, it is a battlefield of books, and the literary production of many centuries had their share in the battle. Some of the belligerents have perished outright and are literally ground to dust in the terrible, terrible struggle for space, whilst others, as if overtaken by a general crush, are squeezed into big, unshapely lumps. Indeed, and this is perhaps an apocryphal story, but it is said that Schechter damaged his lungs and shortened his life by the time he spent in this quite dusty, somewhat moldy chamber for weeks late in the 19th century. So the Geniza, as it's called, Geniza is a word that means like a secret treasury, right? And it's still a practice in some Jewish institutions. You'll go to the copy machine at a seminary, and there is a box for recycling, and then there's a box called Geniza. So rabbinical students, if you're copying from the Bible and you accidentally get the wrong page, you don't put it in recycling, you put it in Geniza. And this material is still buried from time to time. This has changed what we know about Jewish history, and it's changed it in several ways. For example, like the book of Ecclesiasticus, in the Cairo Geniza were religious writings that we did not know existed. The Dead Sea Scrolls, right, which my title alludes to, they were discovered about 50 years after the Geniza. And it turns out that the Geniza contained some of the same materials that people got so excited about to find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The writings of the group that lived at Qumran in the east of Jerusalem. We also have the writings of the rabbis and rabbinic thinkers. You're looking at the handwriting, the actual handwriting of one of the most important sages in the Middle Ages, a man named Moses Maimonides. This is a draft of his most famous work of philosophy called A Guide for the Perplexed. And you can see where he has crossed out parts of his draft because he's going to rewrite this part of the text later. So we get not only to see the works of philosophy, but the process by which they were written by these authors. We know what people were reading, right? We know the folk tales that they read by the fire. We know the poetry, both Jewish and Islamic, Christian in its origins, that they shared with their children. We have medical prescriptions about how to have a healthy diet, about how to make cosmetics from different ingredients you could buy in the bazaars of Cairo. And we even have texts written in Arabic and Greek and Coptic and Persian and many other languages that have not survived elsewhere. So I'm a true believer. Can you tell? Okay. So this, though, is my bread and butter, something that the reason I get up in the morning. It's also transformed what we know about the history of daily life in the Middle Ages, across the Mediterranean, across the Middle East, all the way to India, and in rare cases, all the way to the island of Java in Southeast Asia. So here are just an example, and I'll share some more specific examples with you momentarily. In the upper left hand, this is a letter sent from Jerusalem to Cairo. I'll actually talk more about this one. The bottom left is an inventory of the library of a man who had just passed away. And so they were making a list of all his books and possessions so it could be donated or possibly sold. On the right, you see the last letter written to the sage Moses Maimonides by his brother David before his brother David departed on a ship from the Sudan in Africa to make money in the Indian Ocean trade, but he was to drown. And this is the very last thing that he sent to his brother. It's for these reasons that one of the leading historians of the Geniza, a German man who immigrated to British Palestine and then to the United States, called the Geniza, and it's a talk he gave in 1970, the Living Sea Scrolls. Because while the Dead Sea Scrolls are an absolute treasure, they attest to a community that retreated from the world, and good for them. The Geniza attests to a community that was embedded in one of the most cosmopolitan and important political capitals of the Middle Ages, and that was Cairo in the 11th through the 13th centuries. So you need to sort of think about, I want to give you some big ideas that you can hang some of the details I'm going to tell you onto. So if you were born Jewish in the year 1000, absolutely the chances, and by statistically speaking, you would probably have been born in an Islamic land and you would be an Arabic speaker. Because the demographic heart of world Jewry, until much later in the Middle Ages, was in the Middle East and North Africa. These Jews speak Arabic as their native tongue. They do prefer to write it in the Hebrew alphabet. So a lot of what I'm showing you is Hebrew alphabet, but Arabic language. These are Jews who are on the move, right? So even if you were born in Persia or Iraq or what today is Tunisia, those are fine places to live. But a lot of these men picked up sometimes by themselves, sometimes with their families, and they moved for work. They moved to Cairo. Sometimes they would go to India and set up a factory there for a period of years. They would marry local women, have children, and then they would return to Cairo. So this is an interconnected world, right, of Arabic-speaking Jews who participate broadly in the economy. So let me give you some specific examples. And I tease, this is from my greatest hits album. Now, this one, might touch a nerve, and I certainly don't mean it to. But it's a letter, and it is a letter written in the year 1030. So, 995 years ago. And it is written to the head of one of the synagogues in Cairo. So there were multiple synagogues in Cairo because there were different rites or denominations. Um, and the letter says, he says, haven't we here in Palestine? So he's writing probably from Jerusalem. Haven't we here in Palestine received numerous letters from, sorry, I'm trying to make it so I can read my note here. Received numerous letters, the longest of which contains the signatures of 30 odd witnesses, complaining that you are alienating the congregation with your haughtiness and domineering manner. It gets better. Because of you and your son-in-law, many people have switched over to the other synagogue and even to the Karaite congregations. Who are the Karaites? There are people that were also called heretics, right? They were a Jewish denomination or group who thought that the Bible and not rabbinic law was the ultimate authority in Judaism. So we get these snapshots of everyday life, sometimes of something seeming trivial. However, this also speaks to Jewish culture and religion in the Middle Ages, that it was a very fluid environment, right? Where people switched congregations for all different sorts of reasons. And I know that would never happen in Brevard, but I'm just saying. Okay, another of the great things we have in the Geniza is we have so many marriage documents appropriate for the occasion of a 50th wedding anniversary. This is called a ketubah. A ketubah is a wedding contract. Now, a ketubah is a sacred religious document, but it's also an economic contract. Because in a ketubah, a husband says, okay, if I divorce you, I will pay you this much money as alimony. So it's called the delayed marriage gift. And when we marry, I will give you this much. And also a woman who had relatives who were alive, who could, advocate for her, she could also get other protections written into her wedding contract. And so this is just one of thousands of ketubahs that we have. And you have to read it closely with a guide like me, but it tells us something very interesting. So we have in some ways something typical language. It says, be my wife according to the law of Moses and Israel, and I will serve, sustain, cherish, and trust you, just as all Jewish men do with their Jewish wives. Then lower down in this, we have some unusual stipulations. This woman, she's well-placed socially. She has protectors. Our David, this is the groom, has taken upon himself not to force this Nashia, this is her name, the bride's name, to sit with him by the light of a Sabbath candle, nor to eat the fat tail of the sheep, nor to desecrate her festivals on condition that she observe with him his festivals. Okay, this is a little bit opaque, unless you're like me, a super nerd. And what's happening? This is what we would call a mixed marriage. And David is a high-placed person in the rabbinic Jewish community, and Nashia is a Karaite. The same groups that were denounced as heretics were marrying each other. Nashia, because she's a Karaite, they don't believe that you can light fire on the Sabbath. Rabbinic Jews say, no, you just got to do it before Shabbat starts, the day of rest starts, but you can leave it burning. Karaites, no, you got to sit in the dark. So this is saying David can't make Nashia sit next to Shabbat candles because that's offensive to her. They have different dietary standards, even though they both look to the Torah for guidance. The sheep's tail was like fatback, right? Kosher fatback. That sounds absurd, so I take that back. But you know what I'm trying to say? It was seasoning. It was seasoning, but Karaites didn't like to use the fat tail of the sheep. And because they had different ideas about how to figure the calendar, because it's a lunar calendar, Karaites and Rabbinites celebrated the holidays on different days. But here they're saying they're going to respect each other's calendars. Right? So we get portraits from the Geniza into the most intimate aspects of family life. We also get some very poignant portraits of people who are facing their last moments on earth. And this is a letter, and it's written, by a woman to her sister. And she is, we think, on her deathbed. She says, "This is to inform you, my lady, dear sister. May God accept me as a ransom for you, that I have become seriously ill with little hope for recovery, and I have dreams indicating that my end is near. She says, my most urgent request to you, if God the Exalted indeed decrees my death, is to take care of my little daughter and make efforts to give her an education. Even though I know that's kind of unreasonable because there's really not even enough money for her upkeep, let alone for her education. She continues. This is a document I talk about in my book. She says, furthermore, no matter what you do not separate my daughter from my slave woman, the Sudanese woman, and her son, because they are very fond of my daughter. And she then goes, look, sister, I know you like my oldest daughter more than my youngest daughter. But if you disobey me, curse be upon you. So I jest a little bit, but you get an idea that we get sort of into some real issues if we were to dwell on them, about the complexity of the Jewish community, about how family dynamics work, about how people will property to each other, about what is important to someone when they are facing passage right into the world to come. Related to this, right? And this is a phenomenon that I think is really important, and it speaks to a broader set of issues. Now, in order to understand the story I'm about to tell you, I have to give you some more details, right? So essentially, we have to eat our broccoli, I guess, or our vegetables. So you have to know that we live in a world in which Muslims are the top political class. They've conquered Egypt hundreds of years ago. And Jews and Christians, however, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, they've thrived in Islamic Egypt to the same degree that Muslims, rich and poor, have. However, the bargain that's made is this. In Islamic societies, Jews and Christians are subordinated, right? They have a second-class citizenship, and if they accept that subordination, they're granted protection. So the Muslims pledge in their legal system to protect the rights, such as they are, of Jews and Christians. And this includes allowing Jews and Christians to have their own religious traditions, allowing them to have their own courts of law. So there was a Jewish court where you could go get married and divorce and contract legal agreements. But you could also go to the Muslim judge, if you're a Jew or a Christian, to seek a redress of grievances. So what you see on the right is a chart that comes from my colleague Oded Zinger, who's a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he went through and he studied, why did Jews go to Muslim courts as litigants? And the most important thing I want you to see here is what's on the left. The most common instance of a Jew going to a Muslim court was when a Jewish woman took a man to Muslim court. And there are reasons for that, and I can tell you a little bit about them. Let me sort of show you instead of just tell you first. So what you see on the left is a document. Actually, it's two documents. So this is common in the Geniza. So if you look carefully, you can see that this was actually two pieces of paper that were torn apart. And an enterprising researcher discovered that they were related to the same case. And even though for 1,000 years they were physically separated and brought to Cambridge, England in separate boxes, we've been able to reunite them. Today, we use image recognition software, and the computer can say, I think this handwriting is the same. And sometimes we rejoin documents that are in New York and Russia and Jerusalem, and using sort of the suggestions by our software, we can bring back these stories together. What you're looking at here is a record of testimony, a deposition, I guess we would call it. And it's from the perspective of a Jewish man named Ezra. Ezra was pretty well-to-do and well-placed in Cairo. He was a representative of the merchants. So you came to him when you needed warehouse space. You came to him when you needed help packaging your supplies to load them on a ship. You came to him, right, if you had run into other problems, et cetera, et cetera. Ezra had a sister named Mubaraka. Now, Mubaraka would be the perfect Southern Jewish name because Mubaraka means blessed or blessed, right? So we have Ezra and Mubaraka. Their father, unfortunately, has recently died. However, apparently, they've fought over the inheritance. Now, oftentimes in Jewish courts, women didn't feel like they got a fair shake. In the courtroom itself, in Jewish law and some of its details, they favored men. This is an inescapable fact of the culture and the legal system. But there are some important differences in Islamic and Jewish law, even though mostly they rule similarly. In Islamic law, a daughter has a greater right to the inheritance from her father than she does in Jewish law. So here we have Ezra writing to the community or testifying to the community. He comes to the Jewish elders. He says, please come to us and pressure my sister Mubarakah to reconcile and to return away from her sort of the tactics that she's using in our dispute, right? She said, we went to her and we threatened her. We said, look, if you keep trying to use the Muslim courts to get this inheritance, we're going to excommunicate you from the Jewish community. However, this document tells us Mubarakah said, try it. She did not, the document says, she did not pay heed to our words, and she went to the judge of judges. This is the chief judge in Islamic Cairo. Not only that, but she got the judge to send the police to seize Ezra, and he was therefore forced to flee from her. Now, this next part, take with a grain of salt, because one thing Oded Zinger taught me is that when men write about women, they tend to write about them in a scripted way. So whereas women will curse and shriek and scream, men will be very calm and unflappable when they register their objections. So this document writes, he, Ezra, was therefore forced to flee. Mubarakah insists on her claims and in stubborn insolence demands her father's inheritance from her brother in Muslim courts. She has about 5 men supporting her, but they don't fear God. We wrote this document down as our testimony, right? And then some more sort of a benediction. So this is a tip of an iceberg, right? Another case I could show you. A father goes to the vizier, the minister in the Islamic government. My son is a merchant. He was on a ship on the Nile River. He and his partners were murdered, and their gold was stolen. I have a description of the murderer. Please help me find or bring these murderers to justice. Was the son killed because he was Jewish? No. He was a victim of crime. But this Jewish father knows that he can go to Muslim authorities in medieval Egypt and seek out redress for his loss. Another Jewish merchant coming back from India stops in Aden, which is a port city in Yemen, and a corrupt judge sequesters his ship and puts it in a warehouse. The merchant has no sort of leg to stand on there. He doesn't have connections. But so he comes back to Cairo and he again files a petition with Muslim authorities for help getting his stuff back in Aden. He says, please write for me with your seal of authority a letter demanding that I get my lawfully owned goods back. So this is one of the many entanglements that Jews and Muslims had in the Middle Ages, and it's really quite ordinary for this time and place. So I'm going to move now from talking about sort of the very particular details of these documents, and I want to kind of think more broadly about the society. Talking with Howard about also thinking, why do we study the Middle Ages? How in this time of great anguish, can the Middle Ages be part of how we think about the present and the future? And so I'm going to do that. So one of the leading scholars of the Cairo Geniza and of Islamic history, really for several decades, was a professor named Mark Cohen. He's since retired. But this is a book he published first in the 1990s, and then this is the 2008 version. Why am I being so nerdy about that? Because in the 2008 version, he added an essay at the end of the book. This is a book that analyzes the position of Jews both under Christian rule, mainly in different parts of Europe, and then under Islamic rule. And he tries to assess the relative sort of fortunes of Jews who lived in these different areas. And he asks questions about, why did Jews experience life in this way under such and such a Christian rule, and why in this way under Islamic rule? And he says in the 2008 version, right, he's had a decade and a half to think about what his book was really about. And he says, I realize now, years later, that what I was really sketching out was what he calls a paradigm for when the fortunes of the Jews were more secure, more predictable, and when their lives were better protected. And he said, here are five factors. So I'm going to sort of just mention these because in the many years I've been teaching with this book, even though I think it's imperfect in some ways, I think his argument is borne out by evidence. So he says religious exclusivity, right, is a major factor. All religious traditions are multivocal, meaning they have multiple voices. And depending on where we turn, whether if in scripture, church fathers, rabbis, Quran, and many people who did the exegesis of the Quran, we're going to find voices that sometimes conflict, especially in their attitudes towards people of other religions. And he said, so in the societies that he has studied, right, those societies amplify some voices more than others. And that's a choice, right? We have, well, I think many people here coming from their faith communities, we share something in common in that we have these complicated inheritances, right? But we do, I think, have a choice about which voices we promote, which voices we privilege, right? And that's something that I want you all to think about. Second one is the nature of legal status, right? And one of the things for the Middle Ages, power was held so narrowly that everyone was subordinated in some way based on their religion, on their class, so on and so forth. But one of the things that was important is that subordination also came with protection, and that protection included certain rights for Jews, such as going to Muslim courts, rights that they shared with Muslims and Christians. And so having that legal status affirmed and as part of the law and making it explicit was something that he argued allowed for a predictability to life. And so one of the things you'll see if we were to study Europe in the Middle Ages, life could be less predictable there because there were two jurisdictions. There was the ruler's jurisdiction and the churches. And it was more of a mosaic of jurisdictions, where in the Islamic world, there was generally one legal system. So legal status matters. 3, economic diversification. At some points and in some parts of Europe, not all of them, Jews were legally limited to certain professions, usury and peddling. And this had outcomes that were often negative because Jews were both associated with usury and they were convenient targets of kings, for example, who wanted to expropriate their property. Also, it isolated them from the general population. And when they were interacting with Christians, it was a coercive dynamic because the Jews were the moneylenders and the Christians, their sole relationship with Jews was as people who were indebted to them. In the Islamic world, Jews were pharmacists, doctors, grave diggers, street sweepers, merchants, so on and so forth. And so if you think about that diversity, it provided innumerable points of contact for Jews and Christians with Muslims, even though Muslims were sort of the first-class citizens, if you will, in that society. So economic diversification. 4th, degree of social integration, which follows from that economic diversification. Where do people live? And in the Islamic world, if you read a history book, you'll often read something like, oh, so-and-so lived in the quarter of the Jews, or the quarter of the Armenians, or the quarter of the Turks. One thing we've learned in research is that even though neighborhoods had that name, they were ethnically mixed and religiously mixed. And Jews, we know from the Geniza documents, they shared courtyards with Muslims and Christians. They had common walls right between their homes. They shared sort of small gardens in their courtyards. And so there was much more social integration in this place rather than in places that had residential segregation, where people were not likely to interact on a daily basis except in very specific circumstances. 5th, Cohen says, the presence or absence of pluralism. Now, medieval Muslims, they didn't have the word pluralism like we would use it today. And they didn't have sort of same faith of interfaith cooperation, but they felt very strongly that Jews and Christians had what they called in Arabic a deen. A deen was a recognized scripture given by God and held by a people who believed in God. And that God, even though the Arabic word for God is Allah, is the same God of the Israelites, is the same God of the Christians. And this gave way to a certain limited pluralism where by virtue of being what they called a person of the book or a people of the book, these groups, Christians and Jews, had recognized rights and protections, and they were accorded an official status in the Islamic worldview. So why do I mention these 5 factors? They mean something different in how you might translate them to the 21st century than they did in the Middle Ages. But I would suggest that they're values worth fighting for, and that from the Middle Ages, even though we don't want to revive the Middle Ages, mainly because we love modern medicine, I assume, it gives us a point of reflection to think about the reason that some societies have thrived and why some societies have thrived for more of their members, and why societies sometimes fragment, and why in that fragmentation, certain groups might suffer more than others. And so the Middle Ages, the distant past, provides a sort of distorted kind of funhouse mirror for us to look into. And we can't see, ourselves exactly, but we can see the resemblance of our current predicament. And we can ask good questions by virtue of old histories about how we might harness these values or these ethics to build a society in which people have better chances to establish some kind of conviviality, despite differences, despite tensions, despite conflict. The Middle Ages that I'm talking to you about was a vast period of 1,500 years by the definition offered by this man. It's certainly not without its debits and without its cautionary tales. But when you set the history of the Middle Ages against the history of the 20th century and the 21st century, you see that telling a story where you sequester medieval Jewish history as a dark period does not hold up under scrutiny. And so I would argue to you that by reading these sources of everyday life, by looking at how people solve problems, how people got into trouble and out of trouble, and where they looked for justice, that we can slowly build the capacity and the imagination for thinking about how we can build toward a future that you want to live in and that you want for your children and your grandchildren. Thanks very much. I think now we're going to do karaoke or question and answer.
Take the microphone around and yeah. Turn it live. So raise your hand if you have a question. Maybe I'll start. Your book was about slavery and the Jews in medieval Egypt. Can you give us a 3-minute summary of what your conclusion is about that subject?
Gee, thanks, Howard. No pressure. My book, I do a lot of teaching in my community, and I love it. And one thing I find is, especially when I teach Jewish audiences, my book can be kind of painful. Why? Because in medieval society, and in fact for most of human history, Jews have been both amongst those enslaved and captured and ransomed, but they've also been among the slave owners. And in medieval Egypt, like their Muslim counterparts, like their Christian counterparts, Jews were protected from enslavement by Islamic law, but they participated as slave owners in the society. And so that's a story I tell, right? And it's a complicated one that cuts in multiple directions. But it's key to how I think about the Jews in history is that I'm attentive to how the history of the Jews tells a very particular story about Jewish culture and life. But it's also very important to me to illustrate how the history of the Jews speaks to more universal concerns and how to all history. And so this book is both about how Jewish culture was formed through slave owning. Jewish men and Jewish women, their ideals about what made you masculine or feminine was shaped by slavery. And enslaved people became the mothers of Jewish children, right? Through being manumitted and freed. And so it's a global story that involves the slave trade from across the Mediterranean, from as far as India and Central Asia, and also from parts of Africa. And so it's a meditation about how in Jewish history, Jews have been both vulnerable to violence, but they've also been, like most people in the world, people who perpetrated violence. And I think that's ultimately a more honest, if not bracing and painful thing for a lot of the Jews I teach to reckon with. But I think it's a really important starting point to engaging more broadly, right, with neighbors, with other faith communities, right, and thinking about the current moment even. Um, so yes.
Well, I got plenty of questions. What about anti-Semitism in this period? What would you describe the anti-Semitism like in medieval Egypt? Or does that word make any sense?
Yeah, so I definitely think people argue about whether anti-Semitism is the right word to use, but there's definitely anti-Jewish polemic and there's anti-Christian polemic, and it's because these religions are competing for legitimacy, for power, for members. People are converting. Some of those converts are returning, right? So there is a marketplace of religious ideas. And also, and this is something you see from ancient Egypt to Roman times to the Middle Ages to Congress in the 21st century, is that Jews, and even just the idea of Jews, are very useful. And so sometimes, even when interpersonally, there's not animus between a Jewish person and their Muslim neighbor or their Christian neighbor, Jews as a group are targeted. And so sometimes in the Middle Ages, you see this dynamic where a new ruler comes to power and he's trying to stress his bona fides. And one of the ways that he decides to do this is by reviving discriminations that are on the books, kind of like blue laws might be on the books, but that haven't been enforced in decades. And so sometimes in moments of crisis, you do see anti-Jewish sentiment, or in the Islamic context, it's usually paired with anti-Christian sentiment, right? That is used for political purposes. And I definitely think that that doesn't mean there wasn't also interpersonal tension. I'm sure there was, but at least what we see in the evidence, most of the time, it doesn't bear on people's daily experiences.
What were some of the edicts that they enforced during this period that were on the books, but they didn't usually do?
Right. So great question. So the question is, what are some of the kinds of discriminations that were enforced by Muslims? So this actually is another common point of Jewish and Christian history. So the paradigmatic event in Islamic history is a tale told about the conquest of Syria by the Muslims. And it's told that the caliph comes to town and the Syrian Christians, bear in mind that the Middle East is mostly Christian for most of the Middle Ages. The Syrian Christians come out to meet them and they say, look, we'll surrender and we agree to the following. We're not going to wear our hair like you. We're not going to build our houses higher than the houses of the Muslims. We're going to wear this special belt to distinguish us from Muslims. We're not going to teach our children the Quran. And there are some other things. If we do this, we ask that you protect us. The caliph says yes, right? So this becomes the paradigm for how Jews and Christians are fit into medieval Islamic society for over a millennium, like into the 19th century. Historians debate, wait, yeah, but was it really enforced? That's the wrong question. Sometimes it was enforced, a lot of times it wasn't. So why was it enforced when it was? And it was in particular political conditions. And yes, in the period I study, there was a period where a caliph came to power. His name was Al-Hakim. And he said, Jews and Christians, you're banned from the slave markets because slave ownership is a sign of superiority over others, and we can't have that. You must wear the special belt, right? You can't repair your synagogues or churches. His successor reversed those edicts, right, a decade later. So it is not a perfect period, and I definitely don't want to give that impression. And so that is definitely a part of the medieval history that we have to reckon with. And the thing is that I don't think it's inherent or intrinsic to the Middle Ages, or that it's inherent or intrinsic to Islam. It's cyclical and it fluctuates. And the question we should ask is, so why is it happening when it happens? And those are the hard questions that those instances force us to sort of look at. But I think we can answer those questions.
And Craig, when I went to Emory in 1974, well over a third of the students at Emory were Jewish. And yet there wasn't really, except for the high holy days, there really didn't seem to be much of a kind of presence. It was a Methodist university in which there were lots of Jewish students. And I wonder, looking now, this has been 40 years later, if if there is maybe a lower percentage of Jewish students, but I wonder if there isn't a kind of can I say if there isn't, I'll ask you, a greater awareness of the role of Jewish life among students than there was maybe when I was there the first time. And part of that, I think, may have to do with the Middle East and what's going on right now.
That's a lot, there are a lot of layers to that question. And I think it's going to really depend based on who you ask, what students you ask. You're going to get a lot of different answers, and I think that matters. So I would say Jews are more visible on campus for a variety of reasons. One, we have, due to generous sort of philanthropists, we have a center or a program in Jewish studies, the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies, and we host programming. We offer courses in a major and a minor, and Jewish students take that, non-Jewish students take that. We offer Hebrew. There are also different student groups that during holidays will set up what's called a sukkah or a sukkah. You might know the name, you might know of the Feast of Tabernacles. This is the holiday of Sukkot, where Jews build and dwell in booths. And so you'll see those booths on campus in the fall, for example. And so it's a subtle, visible thing that doesn't intrude on the student experience, but it's a conspicuous thing to see. Um, and also there are Jewish fraternities and Jewish sororities. So all those things, I do think that yeah, Jews are part of life at Emory. I think that, since October 7th, I think that some students, it all depends on how their Jewish identity informs their life. And for some of those students, their Jewish identity and the way they construct it has made them feel alienated and scared. But for other Jewish students, their Jewishness leads them to commitment to civic values and to social justice. And it's led them to participate in campus initiatives about rights for all peoples, right? And so Jews, like Christians, like Muslims, are not monolithic. And I think that's really important to pay attention to. And as a a professor of Jewish studies, I get students in my office hours who fall across that continuum. And I feel like my job is to nurture them with questions and to give them the space to sort of think through their positions. I think a lot of Jewish students, they feel like they need those spaces, but they feel that the climate is such that the opportunities for that are hard to come by. And so I think that is something that people like me have to worry about and factor into it. Thanks for your question. There's a lot more there to talk about, but I'll stop there.
Is there much documentation in regard to the Zohar being, coming around in 1200?
So this question is about a book called the Zohar, which is a core work for it's called Kabbalah, sort of Jewish mystical traditions. And I would say that in the Geniza, I would have to check to know if was copies were deposited into the Geniza. I don't know about it, but there were sort of Jewish mystical traditions, and they have shown up in the Geniza. But the primary conduit was actually through Sufism. And so Jewish rabbis of the time, they looked to Sufis. This is a Muslim movement, a pietist devotional movement, and they saw common cause for they wanted to revise Jewish worship to make it more spiritual. And so the mysticism that I see in the Geniza sources and in the reading I do focuses on that connection. And it's the son of Moses Maimonides, Abraham Maimonides, who actually his congregants got really mad at him for doing some of that work. He tried to change how worship services were conducted. Um, but no, the Zohar is not, that's a great question, but it's not something I can recall seeing.
What happened? So I'm just curious about the documents after the initial discovery in the space. So you said a lot of them went back to Cambridge. Then in the interim, all those years, were scholars allowed to continue working in that space? And now are they safe and preserved there in Egypt, or, and I'm assuming scanned and all that at this point,
Yeah.
but
Excellent question and a lot of layers there. So I'll sort of see if I can give you a concise answer, not my strong suit always. Um, so the collection is dispersed around the world. So the lion's share went to Cambridge, but before Solomon Schechter went to Cambridge and cleared out the chamber, some went to Russia, it's in St. Petersburg, some went to Vienna, some went to Oxford, and then Oxford passed, I guess, on the rest. Some is in New York, some is in Cincinnati, some is at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., because antiquities collectors would pilfer it from the chamber and sell it on the open market. And so it's dispersed. I lived through the digitization of much of the Geniza funded by a Canadian philanthropist named Albert Friedberg. And so where before I would have had to travel to Cambridge and all these places to look at the documents, now I can look at high resolution photographs on my computer. So it's kind of a sore subject with Egyptians, right? It raises this really thorny question about who owns the Geniza, because the Egyptian Jewish community is hardly any in terms of numbers, right? But I have Egyptian colleagues who they're very angry that it's not in Egypt. They say this is Egyptian, it belongs in Egypt. And I'm sympathetic to their claim, but then I'm also sympathetic to the idea, well, Jews left Egypt, some by choice, but a lot out of duress, right? And sort of they fled in the 1940s and 1950s. And we have this with other Jewish patrimony from around the Islamic world. Like, who does it belong to? Does it belong in Israel? Does it belong in the country, Morocco or Egypt? But no, I would say, and Cambridge has been excellent about making it accessible to the world. And so the question about where they belong, like I'm open on that question. I think it's a complicated one. The importance is access and preservation. But I also think there is something, I mean, if you think about it is Egyptian, and Jews saw themselves as Egyptians for this centuries long period. And so one way I hope I grow in my career is that, I want to go to Egypt and give talks to Egyptian students and I've started to make those connections, right? I think it's an important story to tell in Islamic society. And it shows, right, what a chapter that eventually came to kind of abrupt end in the 20th century. But for the reasons that I'm talking to you here and what I'm talking to you about, I think that Muslims, they're receptive to this story and they see it as part of their heritage. And some of them are very sad that Jews left Egypt and other places. They understand why, but it's not something they're proud of. Yeah.
You mentioned the two halves of a document that were separated by thousands of miles and were discovered. And that intrigues me because I'm guessing that AI is now playing some part in all of this. Would you share a little bit about the technology involved and how scholars are working together with that technology?
Yeah, great question. It's exciting time. Sometimes a worrying time. I like being employed. Um, so you can sort of tell from the examples I showed you, they're very hard to read, even for a computer, because they're mutilated, they're faded, et cetera. So the most promising sort of computer-assisted technology right now is handwritten text recognition. And this is a image recognition software that can take the kind of documents I've showed you, and it can sort of draw these like red lasers or lines across the page that sort of say, oh, here's where the baseline is of the writing. And then it can give you an initial transcription. So it takes the handwriting and it says, okay, this is Aleph, Bet, Dalet, Gimel, Hey, the Hebrew letters. And that's a collaboration between Princeton University and some scholars in Paris, whose affiliation I don't know. But they're building this technology, and I've gone to some workshops where we've done that. The thing is, you still have to go and check every word. And so it's not reliable enough yet to rely on. And the thing too is that because these languages are hybrid languages, like I'm never quite sure in a sentence, even when I know what the sentence means, whether I'm reading Arabic or Hebrew. And some words combine elements of both languages. AI is trained largely on large data sets of modern languages. And so how we get to a point where AI can help us translate these medieval documents, hard for me to imagine now. But could it happen in the future? That could be very revolutionary. We haven't cataloged the whole Geniza yet, right? It's still there's still a lot of stuff. People send me emails every few weeks or months. I found something new. I found something new. Check this out. And it's a lot of material. It's very difficult to read. So computer assistance could play a great role. And certainly the joins, finding those distant pieces and reuniting them, it's that's a lot of fun. It's very exciting. Yeah.
When
Oh, right here. Hi.
when you say digitization, does that mean that it's visual copies of the documents? Or whatever?
So digitization, when I say it, I mean it in two ways. The most important thing for me are high resolution digital photographs of the actual manuscript. And then there are software platforms where I can go in and zoom in, or I can play with the contrast and the brightness to sometimes read letters that are not visible to the naked eye. That can be very important. Digitization, though, is also creating, making these accessible to more people by transcribing them, which means like typing in Hebrew letters, like what it says, putting them on a website. So I can go onto a database and say, how many Geniza letters, mention the name of this person. And the more hundreds of documents we get searchable, the more it unlocks for scholars like me. Especially studying slavery, enslaved people didn't write their own records. So they're kind of like a needle in a haystack sometimes. And so it was very important for me to be able to do certain word searches for the Arabic terms for enslaved people. And when I was starting my dissertation, that was a way that I used digitization to build my corpus of evidence.
I think it's interesting that all of this started with two women that, yes. And I guess my question is, they were not scholars, but they certainly seem to have been pretty remarkable. And it was really their intuition that they had something special that led them to bring in, scholars. Were they allowed to continue to be part of this effort, or were they shut out, or what happened with the two sisters?
Right. Great question. Okay, so small point, so they were scholars, right? But they were scholars at a time where women couldn't enroll at Cambridge University. So let's pause to think about that, right? And generations of talent that were never realized or cultivated. So they were well respected in Cambridge because they lived in a time too where people were traveling all over Europe and the Middle East on this kind of grand tour, right? It was a cultural thing you did in the 19th century, very Victorian. And they went to a monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, St. Catherine's. And there they found the single oldest extant copy of the Gospels written in the Syriac language. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. So the language that Jesus spoke, Aramaic, survived through the Middle Ages, and it was a Christian liturgical language. And copies of the Bible were translated into Aramaic so Christians could understand it. So they went and they took hundreds of photographs using 19th century photographic technology, and they published their findings. And they wrote one very scholarly book, which was about these, and then they wrote kind of a pulpy thing like the discovery of the Codex. So, and what's other great about, I think these ladies were known in Cambridge, so their biographers describe them, this blew my mind. Okay, they were both Calvinist and Bohemian in their outlook. Sorry, what? One page later, they were Presbyterians with a reputation for partying. And so, yeah, I mean, gosh, you get that question at a job interview. What 5 people do you want to invite to dinner? Obviously, Agnes and Elizabeth. And so, but the question so the Geniza research went really, really slowly because the sort of bar for being able to read the originals is I guess really high. And then also, so I don't know their story as far as I know what the Geniza kind of ended with that, but they kept doing works of scholarship and exploring the Middle East and Europe. But as far as the Geniza story, I haven't read more about them, but there is a collection at Cambridge in the library called the Lewis Gibson Collection. So there's a collection there named after them. And these are different fragments that are kind of parallel to the Geniza, but maybe not brought back by Solomon Schechter. But they're the collection that these women assembled over their lives, and they made a bequest to the library. And I use some of their documents in my book that haven't been yet much studied. And so I guess sort of their legacy lives on in that collection, which is available digitally to scholars. So the biographical details that I shared about them come from this great book called Sacred Trash. Heretical title, but great book. And it's about the discovery of the Geniza. So, if you like these kinds of stories, like Indiana Jones-ish, but real, it's a great book, good beach reading even. That's a great place to get to know more about the Geniza and about Agnes and Elizabeth. Yes, sir.
I have a question concerning the maintenance of Jewish identity,
Mm.
if we can even find what a real Jew is today in the past. I have a scriptural parallel. When the Jews were in Egypt for 400 years, they were basically excluded from the Egyptian society. So says the scripture. In contrast, when the Jews were in Babylon, they were more incorporated. They were accepted within the Babylon society. In both returns to Israel, under Egypt, the vast majority of Jews went back to the land of Canaan, whereas in Babylon, where they were incorporated, less than 5% of the Jews went back to Canaan.
Mm.
So I'm wondering if there's a parallel, or maybe it's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah. How do I wrap my mind around that? I think that, so we're talking about sacred histories that are hard to document outside of scripture, right? I think that the Babylonian question is interesting. It does reflect two different models. I mean, Jews left Egypt under duress, and I guess they had to leave all at once. I would say that the Jews of medieval Egypt, they celebrated Passover, but to them, Egypt was still a land of opportunity, right? And I think that the biblical Egypt felt distant to them in the sense of like their circumstances were so different. And the Jews of Babylon, returning with sponsorship from the Persians, I'm not sure quite how to handle your question, I'll be honest. Let me think about it, and maybe we can chat after and you can redirect me. But I don't have much more to add, I'm sorry.
It seems like a really weird thing, the Jews of Egypt celebrating Passover, leaving Egypt. That's a very remarkable thought, isn't it? They're living in Egypt, they're back.
So, well, that's something I can talk about. So he's talking about it seems weird to be in Egypt and celebrating Passover. So in medieval Egypt, so there's a Passover Haggadah is your guide for how to celebrate the Passover Seder. So in a Haggadah from medieval Egypt, there's a part that says, how do you teach your kids about Passover? When your son asks, Dad, what is slavery? The Haggadah says, well, you say, son, look at that slave man, look at that enslaved woman, that's slavery. Right, so here in Egypt, the Jews are being told to point to the enslaved people in their house to teach about slavery to their children, which to like a modern person is, hard to wrap around. But for most of human history, people knew slavery was evil, but the miraculous thing was not to be a slave yourself, right? Wasn't the idea, abolition wasn't something that they could wrap their mind around. In the front and then in the blue shirt.
Going back to the role and importance of women in history, I love the story you shared about the woman who wanted her father's inheritance. Was that an exception, or, have there been other documents, other stories found about strong women during this period?
Answer is definitely yes. And we have even women who were sort of business people in their own right. Women owned real estate and they would give loans to people like pharmacists who were starting their own businesses from their assets, and then they would expect to be paid back. And if they didn't get paid back, they'd go to court and they'd sue the people who owed them money. And so within the confines of what legally they were allowed to do, yes. But the thing about Jewish law is, and this is still a modern ongoing crisis, is that Jewish marriage law is so asymmetrical in favor of the husband. And these women's stories show that also. But outside of that very specific issue of marriage and divorce, like some women, if they had assets, if they had living male relatives who could sort of be their intermediaries with authorities, they could do a lot. But women who were less well placed had fewer options. Sir, yes.
Have you done any research about the relationship between the Torah and the Quran and the formulation of the Quran?
That's not my main line of research, but I can tell you some things that I think speak to how they're intertwined. Like, so first of all, you study the Quran for an amount of time and you realize the Quran tells the stories that I know from, or you might know from the Hebrew Bible and from the Gospels. And so realize, right, that the Quran talks about the Torah of Moses and the Gospels of Jesus, for example. One thing I think is interesting about the Quran is that Arabic influenced Hebrew and it influenced the way Jews thought about the Hebrew language. Jews also, so the word Quran literally means recitation. It's the recitation of Muhammad, of God's word that God delivered to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. So some Jews who spoke Arabic, that was their mother tongue, they called the Torah al-Quran al-Adim, the great Quran, right? That seems strange, right? The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, called by a pious Jew, the great Quran. And what they were saying is that the Torah is also a great recitation. And so that's one way where you see sort of an aspect of the influence of the Quran and the influence on Jewish culture. Also, the medieval rabbis were inspired to write new forms of Hebrew poetry by exposure to Arabic language and the meter, and there's rhyme in the Quran. Rabbis they translated the whole Torah into Judeo-Arabic because their congregants they didn't know Hebrew well. They wrote dictionaries defining Hebrew words in Arabic. So about the Quran specifically, there's a lot more to say, but about its interface, I think, with Jews is it's a shared religious culture, reverence for the word, reverence for the eloquence of language. You see Jews start to say, Muslims are very proud of it. Quranic Arabic, it represents like the apogee of them for eloquence. So you start to see Jewish writers talk about like the Mishnah that way, that it's like the most sort of eloquent Hebrew. And so those are just like a tip of an iceberg, I guess I see when I think about the Quran and Muslim religious culture and Jewish religious culture.
Your time for
So I would just like
two more
to ask,
questions.
you've been extremely generous both with your time and your scholarship. And if you don't want to go in this direction, it's okay by me, but I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the Cohen paradigm relationship to the current administration and current in this country.
I mean, I deliberately sort of talked about the paradigm instead of like making specific sort of prescriptive comments about the administration. It's like I have no problem sharing my political views with you, but I don't do it up here because I think what's important, and I want what all of you to do, find experts who care about evidence and who are transparent about their sources and the evidence they use, who grow, which means sometimes they admit they're wrong. And so, like, yes, I'm very happy to talk with you about that. I have a very strong point of view. But the reason why I want to focus on the paradigm is because I want to challenge all of you, no matter where you're coming from, to take what I just taught you very seriously and to show that it's relevant to you. And Sharon, when I'm talking about my politics, I'm a civilian. I don't have a lot of value added for you, right? You and I are peers, and I don't have expertise. So that's why I don't do
One
that.
last
Sorry.
question.
I appreciate you.
No? Okay, thank you so
All right.
much.
Thank you.
We appreciate everyone's coming and we look forward to seeing you next time.
So, my name is Howard also.
Hi, Howard. Nice to meet you.
I'm a Shapiro. I'm also a rabbi.
Oh, wonderful.
You right?
Yep.
First thing, you was terrific. Very much. And I've also been quiet. I don't. Where Jewish
So, they are all, they're all over the place, right? Some of them,
the same.
they're craving with people who think, like, theoretically, they disagree, even Jewish life, financial status, they are so turned off by the polarization that they just want some reconciliation. They're very disappointed in it. So it's like you and other students, very threatening, and they're here. They want the adventures. And so they're not.
I'm sure they're not. I'm sure of that. But but it's not for. I have to. I read on it. They come to. It's just the world of some conversation. We'll be a bunch here. Let's give you a big.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's appropriate because that's like a very residential situation. I think the university has failed to give our students spaces to really talk about. It's because they're at least in this people, they're limiting so much change for various different reasons. We're not fulfilling our goal with the show. It's because of politics of it. And there's also a power of asymmetries. The donor classes, administration, they tend to fall on one side of the board. And people who want to create a more open environment. So I think that that's one reason why the chances for being able to talk about why would a Jewish person feel so unsettled by being.
It does.
It's actually it's like happens at the lowest levels, organized in the grassroots, and there's not sort of real institution. That's something I feel like I'm able to do a lot of office hours in the classroom, but I feel like I have to that institutional.
I don't want to take away from everybody, but
Right. Thanks for your question. I mean,
I know.
I think that I thought a lot about what do I want to say about that. I was thinking more people were going to ask me about. And I'm trying to decide like what do I want to do? I mean, I don't.
Oh.
And I'm very good. Trying on different hats, like kind of scholar, professional analysis. So maybe in 2 years, I will answer that question every but I gotta keep growing and finding my way.
Well, I think you're a very literate, scholar.
Thank you very much.
And I appreciate it. It was about the current administration's policies concerning DEI and civil society and relationships. What he talked about in the Islamic area.
Well, I was living from Rome on the
That's what I heard. Barbara?
Above my head, and I get the paradigm.
I went to that very.
Yes. So
Yes.
if I'm looking for transparency, what's going on?
So I think you have to go slow. And when you're looking at news source. You don't have, I don't know whatever the main way you have news, TV, radio, whatever. Like you have to start paying attention to like where is this information coming from? And, okay, I can see that. I mean, sometimes you have to click through like a newspaper articles today. Like a lot of times they link to their sources. You click through and like look at the source and be like, or, you know, oh, do I actually think that that's a fair summary? But you do that a little bit and find the voices you trust. Until they give you a reason not to trust. I mean, I read like mainstream newspapers, like New York Times doesn't have but like I have that. I follow people on social media who are scholars who I trust, and it's because I know that they are transparent and they care about evidence, and so everyone has a bias. So like if someone harps on about bias without knowing that they understand that red flags. You know, so I think that and so I have people on social media like about Irish Month, which is like a network. And there are people who are scholars who like post publicly about these things, and I read what they write and I read what they post. Well, no, it's like, I mean, it's like you're gonna find the worst stuff there and the best stuff there. You know what? Do you have like my flyer where you can find me and send me an email? I can give you names of people that you could follow. I'd be happy to do that, like a little starter of sources. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all right, Barbara. See you. But so I've gotten to know a little bit about her story. I know the video still. Moderate just it's interesting that you got people to get out of here. I'm just familiar. Thank you. I lived in Morocco. I was always there. Absolutely. Friend in Morocco because I've been we're like Berber Moroccans and both of things. I have a bit of reference. You know, very serious. European Arab. It's order the whole. Well, yes, like the French parliamentarians, it's very like. But I'm going to saw you another workshop that what was your name?
Because I know her students responsibility. That's what I've been.
Creating. Yeah, but the idea that
That was turned off.
No, I've been going up to them for many of the workshops.
like there's a right way of nobody can